Welcome in, everybody, to our deep dive, this time into the Battle of Antietam.
Yeah.
We're going to explore this pivotal moment in American history, not just as a clash of armies, but as a turning point that really sent ripples through the nation and beyond.
Yeah, for sure. And we've got
And to help us do it, we've got...
a fascinating mix of sources.
We do.
Yeah, historical accounts, personal letters,
Medical record.
medical records, early war photography.
Yeah, a really multifaceted view.
Multifaceted, yeah. It's remarkable to see how a single day, September 17th, 1862, could become a catalyst for so much change in medicine, in technology, and in the way we even think about war itself.
I am struck by the contrast that is described in some of these accounts. Like, imagine this. It's September in Western Maryland.
Right?
Rolling hills, bountiful farms. Ezra Carman, who actually fought at Antietam, wrote about the incredible beauty of the valleys.
Wow.
A landscape that must have seemed almost idyllic,
Yeah.
especially to soldiers coming from less developed regions. That juxtaposition of the landscape's beauty with the impending carnage is, I think, so powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really underscores that we're not just talking about troop movements and strategies, but about the human experience of war.
Right. And to understand that experience, we need to understand what led these armies to Antietam.
Right?
Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, had launched a daring invasion of the North, and it wasn't just a military campaign.
Right.
It was a calculated gamble to influence the upcoming Northern elections and gain international recognition for the Confederacy.
Yeah, this is where we see Lee's strategic brilliance. Right? He understood that war wasn't just fought on battlefields,
Yeah.
that victories could translate into political and diplomatic leverage. But his army arrived at Antietam depleted, having lost nearly half its men to the just brutal realities of 19th century warfare.
So this strategic offense plus tactical defense concept that you mentioned when we were prepping for this deep dive, can you unpack that a little bit?
Of course. Yeah, so Lee was outnumbered and outgunned by the Union Army.
Right.
So his strategy was to strike deep into Northern territory, hoping to force a decisive battle on his terms, while tactically defending key positions to minimize casualties. And his army's condition made this approach even more crucial.
Right.
He couldn't afford a protracted war of attrition.
So we've got Lee pushing north with a depleted but determined army.
Yes.
What about the Union side?
On the Union side, we encounter George B. McClellan,
Okay.
a complex and fascinating figure. He was a brilliant organizer, obsessed with logistics, and convinced of his destiny to save the Union. His letters to his wife are full of grand pronouncements about his role in the war.
But McClellan's critics saw him as overly cautious,
Right.
even paralyzed by indecision.
Yeah. How do we reconcile his strategic brilliance
Right.
with this apparent fear of action?
It's a really good question.
Yeah, it's a key question.
Yeah.
McClellan was deeply insecure,
Okay.
despite his outward confidence.
Yeah.
And this insecurity really influenced his decision-making. He was a student of Napoleonic warfare, which emphasized grand maneuvers over decisive battles.
Okay.
And there's a telling anecdote about McClellan and his close advisor, Fitzjohn Porter,
Yeah.
being the only ones left on a hilltop under intense enemy fire.
Oh, wow.
Everyone else had the good sense to take cover.
Yeah.
But it illustrates McClellan's reliance on a small circle of advisors
Right.
and his hesitation to engage directly.
So while Lee was taking risks, McClellan was perhaps too focused on minimizing losses, even at the cost of decisive action.
Exactly. And while these two armies were clashing,
Yeah.
a medical revolution was brewing amidst the carnage, driven by the horrific wounds inflicted by the new mini-ball.
Yeah, we've got a description of that here. Imagine this. The mini ball was designed to deform on impact shattering bones and creating these massive exit wounds.
Ugh.
Surgeons were dealing with a level of carnage they'd never seen before.
And the mini-ball's unique properties forced battlefield medicine to adapt very quickly.
Right.
Amputation often became the only option to save a soldier's life. And remember, this is before germ theory was widely accepted.
Right.
Pre-war ideas about disease were primitive at best.
The sources paint a pretty grim picture of army camps as breeding grounds for disease.
Right.
Filth, lack of hygiene, reliance on folk remedies.
Right.
It's no wonder that diseases like dysentery and typhoid were rampant.
It was a perfect storm for outbreaks. But amidst this chaos, we see the emergence of the Sanitary Commission,
Okay.
a truly remarkable organization. They brought a data-driven approach to the problem. advocating for the professionalization of medical aid, and they really challenged the traditional charities that often clung to ineffective, even harmful practices.
This sounds like a major turning point in the history of battlefield medicine.
Absolutely. The Sanitary Commission's efforts, combined with the innovations of individuals like Jonathan Letterman, the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, laid the groundwork for modern military medicine.
Speaking of Letterman, he was remarkably young to be in such a crucial position.
He was.
Right.
He was, and yet he rose to the challenge.
Yeah.
Letterman's legacy includes the creation of a dedicated ambulance corps, the design of improved four-wheeled ambulances,
Wow.
and the implementation of the triage system,
Wow.
all born out of the necessity of dealing with the sheer volume of casualties at Antietam.
Wow. So now, while generals strategized and doctors innovated,
Right.
the soldiers on the ground experienced Antietam in a very personal way.
Right.
Let's kind of delve into their stories a little bit.
Yeah.
One that really stood out was that of Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr.,
Right.
the future Supreme Court Justice, who was a young officer at Antietam.
Yeah.
And his writings offer just a raw personal glimpse into the realities of war.
Holmes's account of being wounded, his near-death experience, and his disillusionment with romantic notions of war are incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
He even shares this darkly humorous anecdote about wanting the other fellow put in the ambulance first when he was wounded.
I am struck by that blend of dark humor and just profound disillusionment in his writing. And it seems to reflect a shift from this youthful idealism to a hardened realism.
And that shift is echoed in the writings of other soldiers.
Yeah.
You see this stark contrast between the idealism of those fighting for a cause they believe in
Right.
and the cynicism of veterans like Ambrose Bierce, whose writing is just laced with dark humor and a sense of detachment.
Yeah.
Bierce seemed to believe that those who had witnessed the true face of battle possessed a knowledge that civilians could never truly grasp.
There's an anecdote about a group of Union soldiers in a tavern and casually responding, "Yasses," when a local accused them of destroying the place.
Oh, wow.
It's a small detail, but it just speaks volumes about the soldiers' detachment.
Right.
Their almost matter-of-fact acceptance of the destruction around them.
That detachment, that ability to compartmentalize, was likely a survival mechanism in the face of such unimaginable carnage.
Right.
And Antietam forces us to confront the reality of death on a scale that's difficult to grasp even today.
Yeah.
It's often called America's Bloodiest Day. But it's important to remember that this was a time when death,
Yeah.
especially among the young,
Yeah.
was far more commonplace.
Life expectancy was shorter. Infant mortality was higher.
Right.
People were just accustomed to dealing with death in a way that we simply aren't today.
Precisely. There's a poignant story about a man named E.K. Whiteman
Okay.
who traveled from New York to retrieve the body of his son,
Wow.
a soldier killed at Antietam.
Wow.
His determination to bring his son home, even as the body was decomposing,
Yeah.
speaks to the importance of these rituals, this need to honor the dead.
And yet that was a luxury many families didn't have.
Right.
Think about the mass graves, the anonymity of so many battlefield burials.
Yeah.
It's heart-wrenching.
It is, and this is where Alexander Gardner's photographs come in.
Okay.
He was one of the first to capture the aftermath of battle with such stark realism. There's a famous image of a dead Confederate officer's horse titled, "Is This Death?"
Wow.
It's a haunting image. But it also reveals how Gardner, even as he aimed for realism, still adhered to certain artistic conventions,
Okay.
perhaps sanitizing the true horrors to some degree.
It's as though he was trying to bridge the gap between what people could handle seeing and the brutal reality of the battlefield.
Perhaps. And in the aftermath of Antietam, we see this surge of morbid curiosity.
Yeah.
People flock to the battlefield, almost like tourists,
Wow.
creating this tension with the soldiers who are still there, trying to process what they had experienced.
It must have been jarring for those soldiers
Right.
to have their trauma turn into a spectacle.
Absolutely. And while Antietam was this pivotal battle,
Right.
it was also a catalyst for political change.
Okay.
Just a few days after the battle, Lincoln, emboldened by the Union victory,
Okay.
issued the Emancipation Proclamation.
Lincoln's timing seems impeccable, but wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation kind of a risky gamble? How did it affect the already complex political landscape?
The Emancipation Proclamation was indeed a bold move,
Yeah.
and it had profound implications.
Yeah.
It's often viewed as this sweeping moral statement,
Right.
but it was also a shrewd political maneuver.
And the reactions to it were varied, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. You had abolitionists like Holmes rejoicing,
Right.
seeing it as a monumental step towards ending slavery.
Right.
But there was also outrage within the Army,
Wow.
even among some in the North
Okay.
who weren't ready to accept the idea of freeing enslaved people.
So for the soldiers, Antietam seems to have marked a transition for many, from idealistic youth to hardened veterans.
Yes.
Holmes wrote, "I started in this thing a boy. I am now a man."
Yeah, that sentiment captures the profound impact of Antietam on the individual level.
Right.
It was a turning point, not just in the course of the war,
Yeah.
but in the lives of those who fought there.
Right. And the war's impact extended far beyond the battlefield, reaching into the lives of women in profound ways. Let's talk about that. The war created new opportunities for women to serve in hospitals,
Right.
challenging traditional gender roles.
Yeah.
Figures like Clara Barton emerged,
Right.
dedicating themselves to caring for the wounded.
Barton's story is fascinating.
Yeah.
She was incredibly brave and dedicated,
Yeah.
but her approach was very personal,
Mm.
almost amateurish compared to the more organized efforts of groups like the Sanitary Commission.
Her efforts highlight the contrast between traditional charitable approaches and the emergence of a more professionalized, data-driven approach to medical aid.
Right.
A real turning point in the history of humanitarian efforts.
Indeed.
So in many ways, the Civil War,
Yeah.
and Antietam in particular,
Right.
serve as a microcosm of the larger societal transformations that were underway.
Absolutely.
We see it in medicine, technology, politics,
Yeah.
and even how we think about war and humanitarian aid.
Exactly. And perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Civil War is the human cost,
Right.
the physical and psychological scars that lingered long after the battles ended.
Let's talk about that.
Okay.
The war left many veterans, both men and women, grappling with the trauma that they had experienced.
Right. We're talking about physical disabilities, of course,
Right.
but also the invisible wounds of war,
Right.
PTSD survivors' guilt,
Yeah.
the difficulty of reintegrating into civilian life.
Mm-hmm.
These were burdens that many carried for the rest of their lives.
It's a stark reminder that the true cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield and far beyond the official end of hostilities.
Indeed, and for those who survived,
Yeah.
the question of how to make sense of their experiences,
Right.
how to reconcile the horrors they'd witnessed with the ideals they'd fought for,
Yeah.
became a lifelong struggle.
I'm curious about the broader societal impact of this trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Did the Civil War change how America viewed veterans and their sacrifices?
It's a complex question.
Yeah.
On one hand, there was this surge of patriotism and a desire to honor those who had served.
Yeah.
Monuments were erected, memorials were built,
Right.
and veterans organizations flourished.
But was that the whole story? Was there also a sense of unease, perhaps even a fear of these men who had experienced such unimaginable violence?
There was definitely a tension there.
Yeah.
Veterans were often seen as both heroes and potential threats.
Oh.
Some struggled to reintegrate into civilian life,
Right.
haunted by their experiences, unable to find meaningful work,
Mm-hmm.
and ostracized by a society that didn't fully understand what they had endured.
It seems like the Civil War, while a catalyst for so much progress, also left this legacy of trauma and social fragmentation that lingered for generations.
That's a very insightful observation.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the complex and often contradictory legacies of war.
Yeah.
We see the advancements, the innovations,
Yeah.
the heroic sacrifices,
Right.
but we also have to acknowledge the lasting wounds, both physical and psychological, that war inflicts on individuals and societies.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that kind of raises a crucial question, like how do we reconcile the Civil War's seemingly outdated tactics with the fact that it spurred such massive advancements?
Hmm.
Why did this particular conflict become a catalyst for modernity in medicine technology and in our understanding of war's human cost?
It really is a paradox. On one hand, you have these massive armies maneuvering like something out of a history book.
Right.
On the other hand, you have these incredible innovations happening.
Right.
Almost like necessity became the mother of invention on a national scale.
Exactly. And the sheer scale of the Civil War is
Yeah.
a key factor here.
Yeah.
We're talking about hundreds of thousands of men involved,
Right.
a vast logistical challenge that simply couldn't be met with existing solutions.
Yeah.
The need to move troops and supplies quickly fueled the expansion of the railroad.
Right.
Communication became paramount,
Mm.
pushing the telegraph to its limits.
And as we discussed earlier, the need to treat those horrific wounds in the field just spurred all these innovations in medicine. I mean, the Civil War was just a brutal testing ground for both technology and medical practices.
Precisely. And then there's the impact on our collective understanding of war.
Right.
You mentioned photography earlier.
Yeah.
Gardner's work at Antietam wasn't just about documenting the aftermath.
Right.
It was about bringing the reality of war home to the public in a way that words simply couldn't.
Yeah, those images must have been shocking to people at the time. Did they challenge that kind of romanticized view of war that was so prevalent in the 19th century?
Absolutely. Yeah, these photographs, despite some degree of sanitization, forced people to confront the brutality, the sheer carnage of industrialized warfare. And this shift in perception is another way in which the Civil War bridges the gap between those old ways of thinking about war and the modern understanding of its just devastating consequences.
So Antietam wasn't just a turning point in the war itself,
Right.
but also in how we perceive and understand war.
Yeah.
It's almost like a collective trauma that forced America to confront some uncomfortable truths.
That's a very insightful way to put it. And speaking of uncomfortable truths,
Yeah.
Antietam had profound implications for the course of the war itself.
Right.
Lincoln, emboldened by the Union victory,
Mm-hmm.
issued the Emancipation Proclamation just a few days later.
The timing seems incredibly strategic.
Yeah,
It wasn't just a moral declaration, it was a calculated political move.
precisely. The Emancipation Proclamation was carefully crafted to fit within the existing legal framework, a testament to Lincoln's political acumen.
What were the reactions to the proclamation? It must have been incredibly divisive.
It was. Abolitionists like Holmes, who we discussed earlier,
Right.
saw it as a turning point in the fight for freedom.
Right.
However, there was also outrage within the Army
Wow.
and among some segments of the Northern public who weren't ready to accept the idea of freeing enslaved people.
It's a reminder that even amidst a war fought over slavery, there were deeply conflicting views about race and equality.
Right.
The Emancipation Proclamation didn't magically resolve those tensions.
Right.
It brought them to the forefront.
It did indeed. And for the soldiers who experienced Antietam firsthand, the battle and the proclamation that followed marked a profound personal transformation.
Right.
Holmes, reflecting on his experience, wrote, "I started in this thing a boy. I am now a man."
That line is so poignant.
Yeah.
It speaks to that loss of innocence, the harsh realities that these young men were forced to confront.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And while Antietam had a profound impact on the men who fought there, it also had far-reaching consequences for women.
Right.
The war, as we've touched upon, created new opportunities for women to serve in hospitals.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Okay.
The war challenging traditional gender roles.
Right.
Figures like Clara Barton emerged, dedicating themselves to caring for the wounded.
Right. Barton's story is a fascinating one.
It is, yeah. Her approach, as you mentioned earlier, was very personal, almost amateurish compared to the more organized efforts of groups like the Sanitary Commission.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that contrast a little bit?
Certainly. So Barton was driven by compassion and a deep sense of personal responsibility. She saw the suffering of individual soldiers and felt compelled to act. Her efforts were heroic,
Yeah.
but they also highlight the limitations of a purely individualistic approach to humanitarian aid.
It's like she was a bridge between the old ways of doing things, relying on individual charity and goodwill,
Right.
and the emergence of a more systematic, organized approach to providing aid.
Precisely. The Sanitary Commission, in contrast to Barton's more personal approach, embraced this data-driven scientific approach to improving sanitation and medical care.
Wow.
They collected statistics, they analyzed trends, and they advocated for policy changes based on evidence.
Yeah.
This shift towards a professionalized, organized approach to humanitarian aid was a major turning point.
So in many ways, the Civil War, and Antietam in particular, serve as this microcosm of the larger societal transformations that were underway. We see it in medicine, technology, politics, and even how we think about war and humanitarian aid.
Exactly. And perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Civil War is the human cost.
Right.
The physical and psychological scars that lingered long after the battles ended.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
The war left many veterans, both men and women, grappling with the trauma they experienced.
Right. We're talking about physical disabilities, of course,
Right.
but also the invisible wounds of war, PTSD, survivor's guilt, the difficulty of reintegrating into civilian life.
Yeah.
These were burdens that many carried for the rest of their lives.
It's a stark reminder that the true cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield and far beyond the official end of hostilities.
Indeed. And for those who survived, the question of how to make sense of their experiences, how to reconcile the horrors they'd witnessed with the ideals they'd fought for, became a lifelong struggle.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, how did a civil war fought with tactics that even then were considered outdated
Right.
become such a catalyst for modernity?
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have these massive armies maneuvering like something out of the Napoleonic Wars.
Right.
Yet at the same time, you have these incredible innovations happening.
It's like the old world colliding head-on with the new.
And the sheer scale of the conflict is a factor. Hundreds of thousands of men involved. A vast logistical challenge that demanded new solutions.
Right.
The need to move troops and supplies quickly led to the expansion of the railroad.
Right.
And communication became vital, pushing the telegraph to its limits.
And then there's photography. We talked about Gardner's work at Antietam.
Right.
But
Right.
this was really the beginning of war photography as we know it.
Exactly.
These images, while still sanitized to some degree,
Yeah.
brought the reality of war home to the public in a way that words never could.
Imagine the impact of those images. They challenged romantic notions of war.
Right.
Forced people to confront the brutality of it all.
Yeah.
And this, I think, is part of what makes the Civil War so pivotal.
Hmm.
It's a bridge between the old ways of thinking about war and the modern understanding of its devastating consequences.
It's like a turning point in our collective consciousness about war.
Right.
One that we're still grappling with today.
Right.
It's clear that the Civil War in Antietam specifically had just a profound impact on those who experienced it firsthand.
Yeah.
But what about those kind of broader, long-term consequences? Like, how did this conflict shape the future of the nation?
Well, that's a question historians continue to grapple with. On one hand, the Civil War resolved the issue of slavery, a moral stain that had haunted the nation since its founding.
Right.
The Union victory ensured that the United States would remain a single unified nation.
And yet the cost of that victory was staggering.
Right.
Hundreds of thousands dead.
Yeah,
The South was just devastated economically and socially.
it was.
It seems like the wounds of the war took generations to heal, if they ever truly did.
Absolutely. And the process of Reconstruction, the attempt to rebuild the South and reintegrate it into the Union, was fraught with challenges. It was a period of political and social upheaval, marked by both progress and setbacks.
And the legacy of slavery, of course, continued to cast a long shadow over American society.
Right.
I mean, the fight for civil rights for African Americans would continue for decades to come.
Indeed, the Civil War may have ended slavery, but it didn't magically erase the deep-seated racism and prejudice that had fueled it.
Right.
In many ways, the struggle for racial equality that unfolded in the 20th century was a direct consequence of the unresolved issues of the Civil War era.
So Antietam, this single battle, this bloodiest day, becomes a symbol not just of the sacrifices made, but of the unfinished work that remained.
That's a powerful insight.
Yeah.
Antietam represents both the horrors of war and the enduring hope for a more just and equitable society.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reminder that the pursuit of freedom and equality is an ongoing process,
Yeah.
one that demands constant vigilance and a willingness to confront the difficult truths of our past.
So for our listener who has been with us on this deep dive, what would you say is the most crucial takeaway from exploring all these sources about Antietam?
I think the key takeaway is this. Antietam, while a single battle in a long and bloody conflict, encapsulates so much of what the Civil War was about. It was a microcosm of the larger struggle, a story of individual bravery and suffering, of military innovation and political maneuvering, of the clash between old and new, and the enduring legacy of a war that continues to shape America to this day.
It's been a fascinating journey exploring these diverse sources and just uncovering the layers of meaning embedded in this one pivotal moment in American history.
Yeah, absolutely.
I encourage you to keep digging, keep questioning, and keep exploring the complexities of the Civil War and its enduring legacies.